I'm Drew Stevenson, and this is a lecture for my professional responsibility class about consent to conflicts of interest and what happens when one of the clients affected revokes their consent to the conflict after the representation is already underway. This little lecture is going to be based on Comment 21 to ABA Model Rule 1.7. So comment 21 begins, a client who has given consent to a conflict may revoke the consent and, like any other client, may terminate the lawyer's representation at any time. Now, there's a couple things I want to make sure that you're clear on. First, that we're talking about a client who consented to the conflict at the outset of the representation, and now they've changed their mind. Keep in mind that this is puts you as a lawyer in a potentially difficult situation because Rule 1.7 requires you to get consent from every affected client when there's a conflict. So let's say you're representing co-plaintiffs or co-defendants. You have to get consent to the conflict from each one of them before you proceed with the representation. And if one of them revokes at some point because they changed their mind, it could jeopardize your ability to represent anyone in the group. You may be forced to withdraw from representing any of them if one of them revokes their consent later on. So that's a word of caution to you as a lawyer. Really think about whether you want to go forward with this at the outset of the representation. Let's talk about another scenario, for example, where you have one client, a new client who comes to you, and they have some sort of legal dispute or legal transaction that they want to do where the other party is one of your other clients who you represent on an unrelated matter. Again, you have to get consent from every affected client in this situation, and if one of them revokes their consent later on, it has implications. It can affect the other clients, your representation of the other clients, because every affected client had to consent. Now, I do want to say something else about, this is a first time in my course where we've encountered the idea that clients can fire you whenever they want. Now, if they fire you halfway through the representation or near the end of the representation, you'll probably maybe still get paid for the work you did up to that point. But keep in mind, clients can, with one narrow exception, always fire you. They can fire you for a good reason, like they're frustrated with you, or you have a disagreement about strategy, you've disappointed them. It could be because they can no longer afford your fees, or they've lost interest in the matter that the representation was based on. Or it could be that for a terrible reason, that they fire somebody every Monday because that's how they start out their week. They found out that you're an Astros fan or that you don't like Taylor Swift or something like that, and they decide to fire you over something that to you seems kind of outrageous. The client still gets to do that. The narrow exception, of course, is if we already have a trial scheduled. Sometimes a judge, if it's on the eve of trial or during a trial, will say no. And the judges have authority, just like they have authority to throw a lawyer off the case or disqualify a lawyer, they have the authority to keep a lawyer on the case to avoid disrupting the proceedings, especially if they think that the client is trying to fire the lawyer just as a delay tactic. Now, I think if the client no longer wants representation by this lawyer, that courts should let the lawyer go. But there are some courts that don't want to do that, and they say, no, we're going to go ahead with the trial, or no, we're going to finish the trial with this lawyer, and then you can try appealing it with a different lawyer if you want. So keep in mind that when you start the representation, the client is always free to fire you, and if you ask for consent to a conflict of interest, any of the clients who consented can revoke their consent at any time, and that can affect whether you're able to continue representing not only them, but the other affected clients. So when one client revokes their consent to the conflict, this may preclude the lawyer from continuing to represent other clients. This depends on the nature of the conflict, how severe it is. Was this kind of a minor conflict of interest, or sort of a potential conflict of interest, or is this kind of a severe conflict of interest or clash of legal interests? Whether the client revoked their consent due to a material change in their circumstances, so are they just being spiteful or whimsical, unstable, or did their situation change? Maybe their financial or legal situation has changed so that they no longer have a stake in the case or a meaningful stake in the case, and they want out of the representation. That can happen. And at that point, they may want to revoke consent. The reasonable expectations of the other client and whether there will be material detriment to the other clients or the lawyer as a result. So the answer is it depends. We're going to have to weigh a number of factors. What was what type of conflict of interest was this? How severe was the conflict? Why is the client who previously consented to the conflict of interest now revoking it? The reason matters, and how it's going to affect other clients. There are circumstances where you're going to let that client go because if they're revoking consent, they've also probably terminated the representation, your representation of them, whether you can continue representing the others. But be aware that there are also circumstances where if one of them who consented revokes their consent, you could be forced to withdraw from representing any of them. So you could end up having to withdraw from representing the whole group, everyone who consented to the conflict, especially in situations with joint representation. You're representing co-plaintiffs or co-defendants in litigation. And that concludes our short lecture about what happens when a client gives informed written consent to a conflict of interest and then revokes it later on.